Here we go. Chapter 8. Search for truth and unexpected answers. Look at that. I can help you. Goldmoon's clear voice rang out like a pure silver bell. The chieftain's daughter saw Sturm's shocked face. She understood Tanis's warning. But this was not the act of a foolish, hysterical woman. Goldmoon was far from that. She had ruled her tribe in all but name for 10 years, ever since sickness had struck her father like a lightning bolt, leaving him unable to speak clearly or to move his right arm and leg. She had led her people in times of war with neighboring tribes and in times of peace. She had confounded attempts to wrest her power from her. She knew that she was doing. She knew what she was doing now was dangerous. These clerics filled her with loathing, but they obviously knew something about the staff, and she had to know the answers. I am the bearer of the blue crystal staff, Goldmoon said, approaching the leader of the clerics, her head held proudly. But we did not steal it. The staff was given to us. Riverwind stepped to one side of her, Sturm to the other. Caraman came charging through the bush and stood behind her, his hands on his sword hilt, an eager grin on his face. So you say, the cleric said in a soft, sneering voice. He stared at the plain brown staff in her hand with avid, black, gleaming eyes, then reached out his wrapped hand to take it. Goldmoon swiftly clasped the staff to her body. The staff was carried out of a great place of evil, she said. I will do what I can to help your dying brother, but I will not relinquish the staff to you or anyone else until I am firmly convinced of your rightful claim to it. The cleric hesitated, glancing back at his fellows. Tanis saw them making nervous, tentative gestures toward the wide cloth belts they wore tied around their flowing robes. Unusually wide belts, Tanis noticed, with strange bulges beneath them. Not, he was sure, made by prayer books. He swore in frustration, wishing Sturm and Caraman were paying attention. But Sturm seemed completely relaxed, and Caraman was nudging him as though sharing a private joke. Tanis raised his bow cautiously and put an arrow in the string. The cleric finally bowed his head in submission, holding his hands in his sleeves. We will be grateful for whatever aid you can give to our poor brother, he said in a muffled voice. And then I hope you and your companions will return with us to Haven. I promise you, you will be convinced that the staff belongs in. I'm sorry. I promise you, you will be convinced that the staff has come into your possession wrongly. We will go wherever we have a mind to, brother, Caraman growled. Fool, Tanis thought. The half-elf considered shouting a warning, then decided to remain hidden in case his growing fears were realized. Goldmoon and the leader of the cloakmen passed the cart, Riverwind next to her. Caraman and Sturm remained near the front of it, watching with interest. As Goldmoon and the cleric reached the back, the cleric put out a wrapped hand and drew Goldmoon toward the cart. She pulled away from his touch and stepped forward by herself. The cleric bowed humbly, then lifted up a cloth covering the back of the cart. Holding the staff in front of her, Goldmoon peered in. Tanis saw a flurry of movement. Goldmoon screamed. There was a flash of blue light and a cry. Goldmoon sprang backward, and Riverwind jumped in front of her, the cleric lifting his horns to his lips and blew a long, continuous wailing note. Caraman, Sturm! Tanis called, raising his bow. It's a trap! A great weight dropped on the half-elf from above, knocking him into the ground. Strong hands groped for his throat, shoving his face into the wet leaves and mud. The man's fingers found their hold and began to squeeze. Tanis fought for breath, his nose and mouth filled with the mud. Seeing starburst, he tore frantically at the hands that were trying to crush his windpipe. The man's grip was incredibly strong. Tanis felt himself losing consciousness. He tensed his muscles for one final desperate struggle, then he heard a hoarse cry and a bone-crunching thump. The hands relaxed their grip and the heavy weight was dragged off of him. Tanis staggered to his feet, his breath coming in painful gasps. Wiping mud from his face, he looked up to see Flint with a log in his hand, but the dwarf's eyes were not upon him. They were on the body at his feet. Tanis followed the astonished dwarf's gaze, and the half elf recoiled in horror. It wasn't a man. Leathery wings sprang from its back. It had scaled flesh of a reptile. Its large hands and feet were clawed, but it walked upright in the manner of men. The creature wore sophisticated armor that allowed it the use of its wings. It was the creature's face, however, that made him shudder. It was not the face of any living being he had ever seen before, either on Krynn or in his darkest nightmares. The creature had the face of a man, but as if some malevolent being had twisted it into that of a reptile. By all the gods, Raceland breathed, creeping up to Tanis. What is that? Before Tanis could answer, he saw out of the corner of his eyes a brilliant flash of blue light and heard Goldmoon calling. For one instant, as Goldmoon looked into the cart, she had wondered what terrible disease could turn a man's flesh into scales. She had moved forward to touch the pitiful cleric with her staff, but at that moment the creature sprang out at her, grasping for the staff with its clawed hand. Goldmoon stumbled backwards, but the creature was swift, and its claws had closed around the staff. There was a blinding blue flash of light. The creature shrieked in pain and fell backward, wringing its blackened hand. Riverwind's sword drawn had leaped in front of his chieftain's daughter. But now she heard him gasp, and she saw his sword arm drop weakly. He staggered backwards, making no effort to defend himself. Rough, wrapped hands grabbed for her from behind. A horrible scaled hand was clasping over her mouth. Struggling to free herself, she caught a glimpse of Riverwind. He was staring, wide-eyed in terror, at the thing in the cart, his face deathly white, his breathing swift and shallow. A man who wakes from a nightmare only to discover it is reality. Goldmoon, a strong child of a warrior race, kicked backwards at the cleric holding her, her foot aiming for his knee. Her skillful kick caught the opponent off guard and crushed his kneecap. The instant the cleric eased his grip on her, Goldmoon whirled around and struck him with her staff. She was amazed to see the cleric slump to the ground, seemingly felled by a blow even the mighty Caraman might have envied. She looked at her staff in astonishment. The staff was now glowing a bright blue. There was no time to wonder. Other creatures were surrounding her. She swung her glistening staff in a wide arc, holding them at bay. But for how long? Riverwind! Goldmoon's cry woke the plainsman from his terror. Turning, he saw her backing into the forest, keeping the cloaked clerics away with his staff. He grabbed one of the clerics from behind and threw him heavily to the ground. Another one jumped at him, while a third sprang towards Goldmoon. There was another blinding blue flash. A moment ahead of Tanis' cry, Sturm realized the clerics had set a trap and drew his sword. He had seen, through the slats of the old wooden cart, a clawed hand grabbing for the staff. Lunging forward, he'd gone to back up Riverwind. But the knight was totally unprepared for the plainsman's reaction at the sight of the creatures in the cart. Sturm saw Riverwind stagger backwards, helpless, as the creature grabbed a battle axe in its uninjured hand and sprang directly at the barbarian. Riverwind made no attempt to defend himself. He just stared, his weapon dangling in his hand. Sturm plunged his sword into the creature's back. The thing screamed and whirled around to attack, wrenching the sword from the knight's hand. Slavering and gurgling in its dying rage, the creature wrapped its arms around the startled knight and bore him to the muddy road. Sturm knew the thing that was grasping at him was dying, and fought to beat down the terror of the revulsion he felt at the touch of the slimy skin. The screaming stopped, and he felt the creature go rigid. The knight shoved the body over and quickly started to pull his sword from the creature's back. The weapon didn't budge. He stared in disbelief, then yanked on the sword with all of his might, even putting his booted foot against the body to gain leverage. The weapon was stuck fast. Furiously, he beat the creature with his hands, then drew back in fear and loathing. The thing had turned to stone. "Caraman!" Sturm yelled as another of the strange clerics leaped toward him, swinging an axe. Sturm ducked, felt a slashing pain, then was blinded when blood flowed into his eyes. He stumbled, unable to see, and a crushing weight bore him to the ground. Caraman, standing near the front of the cart, started to go to Goldmoon's aid when he heard Sturm's cry. Two of the creatures bore down on him. Swinging his short sword to force them to keep their distance, Caraman drew his dagger with his left hand. One cleric jumped for him, and Karaman slashed out, its blade biting deep into flesh. He felt a foul, rotting stench and saw a sickly green stain appear on the cleric's robes. But the wound appeared just to enrage the creature. It kept coming, saliva dripping from its jaws that were the jaws of a reptile, not a man. For a moment, panic engulfed the big warrior. He had fought trolls and goblins, but these horrible clerics completely unnerved him. He felt lost and alone. Then he heard a reassuring whisper next to him. "I am here, my brother." Raceland's calm voice filled his mind. "About time," he gasped, threatening the creature with his sword. "What sort of foul clerics are these?" "Don't stab them," Raceland warned swiftly. They'll turn to stone. They are not clerics. They are some sort of reptile man. That is the reason for the robes and the hood." Though different as light and shadow, the twins fought well as a team. They exchanged few words during battle, their thoughts merging faster than Tug could translate. Cameron dropped his sword and dagger and flexed his huge arm muscles. The creature, seeing Cameron drop his weapons, charged forward. Their rags had fallen loose and fluttered around them grotesquely. Cameron grimaced at the sight of the scaled bodies and clawed hands. "Ready," he said to his brother. "Ash Tazar Similarian Kirauni," as said Raceland softly, and he threw a handful of sand in the air. The creatures stopped their wild rush, shook their heads groggily as the magical sleep stole over them, but then blinked their eyes. Within moments they had regained their senses and started forward again. "Magic resistance," Raceland murmured in awe, but the brief interlude of their near sleep was long enough for Cameron. Encircling their scrawny reptilian necks with his huge hands, the warrior swept their heads together. The bodies tumbled to the ground, lifeless statues. Cameron looked up to see two more clerics crawling over the stony bodies of their brethren. Curved swords gleamed in their wrapped hands. "Stand behind me," ordered Raceland in a hoarse whisper. Cameron reached down and grabbed the dagger and sword. He dodged behind his brother, fearful for his twin's safety, yet knowing Raceland could not cast spells if he stood in his way. Raceland stared intently at the creature, who, recognizing a magic user, slowed and glanced at each other, hesitant to approach. One dropped to the ground and crawled under the cart. The other sprang forward, sword in hand, hoping to impale the mage before his spell was cast, or at least break the concentration that was so necessary to a spellcaster. Cameron bellowed. Raceland seemed not to hear or see any of them. Slowly he raised his hands, placed his thumbs together. He spread his thin fingers in a fan-like pattern and spoke. "Karatangus Mopari." The magic coursed through his frail body, and the creature was engulfed in flame. Tanis, recovering from his initial shock, heard Sturm's yell and crashed through the brush out into the road. He swung the flat of his sword blade like a club and struck the creature that had Sturm pinned to the ground. The cleric fell over with a shriek, and Tanis was able to drag the wounded knight into the brush. "My sword!" Sturm mumbled, dazed, blood pouring down his face. He tried unsuccessfully to wipe it away. "We'll get it," Tanis promised, wondering how. Looking down the road, he could see more creatures swarming out of the woods and heading towards them. Tanis's mouth was dry. "We've got to get out of here," he thought, fighting down panic. He forced himself to pause and draw a deep breath, then turned to Flint and Tasselhoff, who had run up behind him. "Stay here and guard Sturm," he instructed. "I'm going to get everyone together. We'll head back into the woods." Not waiting for an answer, Tanis dashed out into the road, but then the flames from Raceland's spell flared out, and he was forced to fling himself to the ground. The cart began to smoke as the straw pallet and the creature had been lying on them inside caught on fire. "Stay here and guard Sturm, Harf," Flint muttered, getting a firm grip on his battle axe. For the moment, the creatures coming down the road did not seem to notice the dwarf or the kender, or the wounded knight lying in the shadows of the trees. Their attention was on the two small knots of battling warriors. But Flint knew it was only a matter of time. He planted his feet more firmly. "Do something for Sturm," he said to Tass irritably. "Make yourself useful for once." "I'm trying," Tasselhoff replied in a hurt tone, "but I can't get the bleeding to stop." He wiped the knight's eyes with a moderately clean handkerchief. "There, can you see now?" he asked anxiously. Sturm groaned and tried to sit up, but the pain flashed through his head, and he had to sink back. "My sword," he said. Tasselhoff looked over to see Sturm's two-handed weapon sticking out of the back of a stone cleric. "That's fantastic," the wide-eyed Kender said. "Look, Flint! Sturm's sword!" "I know, you fog-brained idiot, Kender!" Flint roared as he saw the creature running towards him, its blade drawn. "I'll just go get it," he said cheerfully to Sturm as he knelt down beside him. "I won't be a moment." "No!" Flint yelled, realizing the attacking cleric was out of Tass's line of vision. The creature's wicked curved sword lashed out in a flashing arc aimed for the dwarf's neck. Flint swung his axe, but at that moment Tasselhoff, his eyes on Sturm's sword, rose to his feet. The Kender's hoopak staff struck the dwarf in the back of the knees, causing Flint's legs to buckle beneath him. The creature's sword whistled harmlessly over the head of the dwarf as the dwarf gave a startled yell and fell over backwards on top of Sturm. Tasselhoff, hearing the dwarf shout, looked back, astonished at an odd sight. A cleric was attacking Flint, and, for some reason, the dwarf was lying on his back, legs flailing, when he should have been up fighting. "What are you doing, Flint?" he shouted. He nonchalantly struck the creature in the midsection with his hoopak, struck it again on the head as it toppled forward, and watched it fall to the ground unconscious. "There," he said irritably to Grimp. "Do I have to do your fighting? Do I have to fight your battles for you?" The Kender turned and headed back towards Sturm's sword. "Fight for me!" The dwarf sputtered with rage, struggling wildly to stand up. His helm had slipped over his eyes, blinding him. Flint shoved it back just as another cleric bowled into him, knocking the dwarf off his feet again. Tanis found Goldmoon and Riverwind standing back to back, Goldmoon fending off the creatures with her staff. 3 of them lay dead at her feet, their stony remains blackened from the staff's blue flame. Riverwind's sword was caught fast in the guts of another statue. The Plainsman had unslung his only remaining weapon, his short bow, and had an arrow nocked and ready. The creatures were, for the moment, hanging back, discussing their strategy in low, indecipherable tones. Knowing that they must rush the Plainsman in any moment, Tanis leaped toward them and smote one of the creatures from behind using the flat of his sword, then made a backhand swing at another. "Come on!" he shouted to the Plainsman. "This way!" Some of the creatures turned at this new attack, others hesitated. Riverwind fired at an arrow and felled one, then he grabbed Goldmoon's hand and together they ran towards Tanis, jumping over the stone bodies of their victims. Tanis let them get past him, fending off the creatures with the flat of his sword. "Here, take this dagger," he shouted to Riverwind as the barbarian ran by. Riverwind grabbed it, reversed it, and struck one of the creatures in the jaw. Jabbing it upward with the hilt, he broke its neck. Then there was another flash of blue flame from Goldmoon as she used her staff to knock another creature out of the way. Then they were into the woods. The woodcart was burning fiercely now. Peering through the smoke, Tanis caught glimpses of the road. A shiver ran through him as he saw dark winged forms floating to the ground about a half-mile away on either side of them. The road was cut off in both directions. They were trapped, unless they escaped in the woods immediately. He reached the place where he had left Sturm. Goldmoon and Riverwind there. So was Flint. Where was everyone else? He stared around in the thick smoke, blinking back tears. "Help Sturm," he told Goldmoon. Then he turned to Flint, who was trying unsuccessfully to yank his axe out of the chest of a stone creature. "Where are Karaman and Raceland? And where's Tass? I told him to stay here. The blasted Kender nearly got me killed. I hope they carry him off. I hope they use him for dog meat. I hope—" "The name of the gods!" Tanis swore in exasperation. He made his way through the smoke toward where he had last seen Karaman and Raceland, and stumbled across the Kender, dragging Sturm's sword back along the road. The weapon was nearly as big as Tasselhoff, and he couldn't lift it, so he was dragging it through the mud. "How did you get that?" he asked in amazement, coughing in the thick smoke that boiled around them. Tass grinned, tears streaming down his face from the smoke in his eyes. "The creature turned to dust," he said happily. "Oh, Tass, it was wonderful. I walked up and pulled on the sword, and it wouldn't come out, so I pulled again, and—" "Not now. Get back to the others." Tass grabbed the Kender and shoved him forward. "Have you seen Karaman and Raceland?" But just then he heard the warrior's voice boom out of the smoke. "Here we are," Karaman panted. He had his arm around his brother, who was coughing uncontrollably. "Have we destroyed them all?" the big man asked cheerfully. No, we haven't, Tanis replied grimly. In fact, we've got to get away through the woods to the south. He put his arms around Raceland, and together they hurried back to where the others had huddled by the road, choking in the smoke, yet thankful for the enveloping cover. Sturm was on his feet, his face pale, but the pain in his head was gone, and the wound had quit bleeding. The staff healed him? Tanis asked Goldmoon. She coughed. Not completely. Enough so that he can walk. It has limits, Raceland said, wheezing. Yes, Tanis interrupted. Well, we're heading south into the woods. Caramon shook his head. That's Darkenwood, he began. I know, you'd rather fight the living, Tanis interrupted. How do you feel about that now? The warrior did not answer. More of those creatures are coming from both directions. We can't fight off another assault, but we won't enter Darkenwood if we don't have to. There's a game trail not far from here we can use to reach Prare's Eyes Peak. There we can see the road to the north, and as well as all other directions. We could go north as far as the cave. The boat's still hidden there, Riverwind suggested. Nope! Yelled Flint in a strangled voice. Without another word, the dwarf turned and plunged into the forest, running south as fast as his short little legs could carry him. End of chapter 8.